The forest has always been my sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the modern world fades into the background, leaving only the rhythmic sounds of nature. I became a ranger to protect that sanctuary, to ensure it remained untamed and alive for generations to come. Whispering Pines National Park was my post for over a decade, a sprawling expanse of wilderness where pine trees stretched toward the heavens and rivers carved through valleys like veins in a giant's body. It was beautiful, yes, but also unforgiving. The park was massive, with parts so remote they hadn't been explored in decades. Whispers circulated among the locals about those deep woods, the hollow, they called it, where paths disappeared. Animals refused to tread, and time itself seemed to warp. Rangers like me didn't entertain such superstitions. We dealt with facts, not folklore. But sometimes facts fail to explain the strange, and you find yourself questioning the solidity of reality itself. I remember the day it all began. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees in golden shafts, and the air smells faintly of pine and earth. I was preparing for my routine patrol when the call came in. Erica Lang, a solo hiker, had been reported missing by her sister. She was an experienced backpacker and had registered her route 3 days ago but hadn't returned. Her intended path led deep into Pine Hollow's North Woods, a part of the park notorious for being difficult to navigate. Dispatch mentioned she'd been last seen near Ridge Trail, where several hikers over the years had reported getting lost or disoriented. It was a familiar area, one I'd patrolled dozens of times, and I assured myself it was just another case of a hiker venturing too far off the marked paths. I strapped on my gear, double-checked my map, and headed out, confident I'd have Erica back on the trail by sundown. As I drove the park jeep along the dirt road leading to the North Woods, a faint sense of unease settled over me. The closer I got to Ridge Trail, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches knitting together overhead like a living cathedral. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves was absent, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. Even the air felt different, cooler, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off as my imagination running wild and parked near the trailhead. The first mile of the trail was uneventful, the path clearly marked with the occasional footprint to indicate Erica had passed this way. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the trail began to fade, swallowed by encroaching undergrowth and fallen branches. That's when I found the first sign that something was wrong. A scarf lay crumpled in the dirt, its edges frayed as though it had been caught on something. Nearby, the ground was disturbed. The soil scuffed as if someone had struggled to regain their footing. I radioed dispatch to report the finding and pressed on, my senses now fully alert. A few minutes later, I found her water bottle half buried under a mound of pine needles. The trail was becoming harder to follow, the footprints now faint and scattered. And then, without warning, they stopped altogether. There were no more signs of Erica No footprints, no discarded belongings, just the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. It was as though she'd been plucked from the earth, leaving no trace behind. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the area with a growing sense of dread. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. It was a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the woods themselves were listening. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself, but the compass needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. Frustration prickled at my skin. I'd dealt with faulty equipment before, but the timing felt too coincidental. I decided to push deeper into the forest, hoping to pick up Erica's trail again. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks growing thicker and closer together. The light filtering through the canopy dimmed, casting the woods in an otherworldly twilight, even though it was still midday. The air grew colder, each breath visible as a faint puff of mist. My boots crunched over fallen leaves and twigs, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. That's when I noticed something strange. The landscape was changing in ways that didn't make sense. Familiar landmarks, boulders, clusters of birch trees appeared where they shouldn't have been, as though the forest was rearranging itself around me. Trails that should have led me back to the main path now looped endlessly, bringing me back to the same spot. It was disorienting, but more than that, it felt deliberate. It was as if the forest was alive, aware of my presence and intent on keeping me there. My unease deepened when I found the claw marks. They were etched into the bark of a towering pine, deep and jagged as though made by something with enormous strength. I've seen bear scratches before, but these were different, too wide, too clean and spaced unnaturally far apart. I ran my fingers over the grooves, the wood splintering under my touch. Nearby, the ground was torn up, the soil clawed as though something had been digging. A faint smell lingered in the air, sickly sweet and metallic like rotting fruit mixed with blood. I continued forward, my heart pounding harder with each step. The silence was no longer just unsettling. It was oppressive, pressing against my skull like a vice. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, leaves crunching. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. I kept my hand near the bear spray on my belt, though I doubted it would be much use against whatever was out here. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement among the trees. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, but the beam revealed only empty forest. I told myself it was a deer or a shadow cast by the swaying branches. But the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. My skin prickled, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to turn back and forget I'd ever come here. But I couldn't. Erica was still out there, and I wasn't going to abandon her. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the oppressive stillness gave way to something far worse. The air carried a sound now, faint but persistent like distant whispers carried on the wind. I paused, trying to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to come from all directions surrounding me. They were indistinct at first, just a soft, unintelligible murmur. But as I stood there, straining to listen, I began to make out fragments of words. Leave, go back, lost. The voice wasn't harsh or threatening. If anything, it sounded mournful, almost pleading. My pulse quickened as I swept my flashlight across the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The beam of light revealed nothing but gnarled branches and shadowy undergrowth. I pressed on, though every fibre of my being screamed at me to turn back. The claw marks became more frequent, etched into nearly every tree I passed. Some of the marks were shallow, as though made in passing, while others were so deep they gouged through the bark and into the wood beneath. It was impossible to ignore the pattern. Whatever had made these marks wasn't aimlessly wandering. It was marking territory. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent with each step. The cold air bit at my face and hands, and I noticed that even the light from my flashlight seemed weaker, its beam swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw it again, the flicker of movement just beyond the reach of the light. I whipped around, heart hammering, and caught a brief glimpse of something large and humanoid darting between the trees. It moved impossibly fast, its limbs long and spindly, almost insect-like. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung the beam wildly, but the figure was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the uneven terrain. But deep down, I knew better. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was no longer subtle. It was overwhelming, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I gripped the bear spray on my belt and quickened my pace, scanning the forest for any sign of Erica. Then I found the campsite. It was little more than a small clearing, littered with the remnants of a fire pit and a torn sleeping bag. The fabric was shredded, the stuffing spilling out like entrails. Erica's backpack lay nearby, its contents scattered and trampled. I crouched down to examine the area, my breath visible in the icy air. The ground was disturbed, the dirt churned up as though there had been a struggle. And there, in the center of the clearing, were footprints. They weren't Erica's. The prints were massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, with clawed toes that dug deep into the soil. I traced the path of the prints with my flashlight, following them as they led away from the campsite and into the darkness. I didn't want to follow them. I wanted to run, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But the thought of Erica kept me moving forward. If there was even the slightest chance she was still alive, I had to find her. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky entirely. The air here was colder still, biting through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. The whispers had returned, louder and clearer now, forming broken sentences that seemed to echo inside my head. Lost. Join us. Stay. The words didn't make sense, but their tone was unmistakable. They weren't coming from a single source. They were all around me, as though the forest itself was speaking. The trail of footprints ended abruptly at the base of an enormous pine tree, its bark scarred with fresh claw marks. I shone my flashlight upward. the beam illuminating twisted branches that seemed to form a canopy of tangled shadows. My stomach churned as I realized there were no other tracks, no sign of where the creature had gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, and then I heard it. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the forest, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, animalistic yet eerily human. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as though the batteries were dying. I fumbled to adjust it, my heart pounding in my ears. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't alone. Multiple growls, overlapping and echoing, surrounded me from all sides. Panic set in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted blindly, the growls and whispers chasing me through the darkness. Branches clawed at my face and arms. Roots snagged at my boots, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. My flashlight lay shattered in the dirt, its light extinguished. The growls had stopped, but the oppressive silence had returned, heavier than before. I crawled to my feet, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. That's when I saw it, the outline of a cabin barely visible through the trees. The cabin was old, its wooden walls warped and rotting with age. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I needed shelter. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting, and I couldn't face it out here alone. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The room was sparsely furnished, a rusted stove, a broken table, and a cot covered in moth-eaten blankets. But what caught my attention was the writing on the walls. Every surface was covered in crude symbols and phrases scrawled in what looked like charcoal. Spirals, jagged lines, and strange shapes that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. The words were worse. The forest doesn't let go. You see it. It sees you. Stay and be part of the trees. In the center of the room, a pile of bones sat arranged in a spiral pattern. Animal bones, I told myself, though some looked disturbingly human. My stomach turned as I backed away, my foot catching on something solid. I looked down to see a journal, its leather cover worn and stained. The entries inside were frantic, almost incoherent, describing a figure that watched from the trees, that moved with impossible speed and whispered in a voice that wasn't a voice. The last entry read, "It's not just one. They are many. They are the forest." A loud creak from the doorway snapped me back to reality. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its form twisting and unnatural. My blood ran cold as its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. For a moment I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor as the shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its form writhing like smoke caught in a windless room. Its eyes glowed faintly, not like an animal's, but something otherworldly, radiating malice and hunger. The whispers in my head reached a fever pitch, blending into a cacophony of voices that seemed to mock my fear. "You see us. You stay. You will join." The figure stepped forward, its long, distorted limbs bending at impossible angles as it moved. Its claws scraped against the wooden floor, leaving deep gouges that filled the room with a screeching noise. I scrambled backward, my hands fumbling for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As the figure closed in, the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting until every breath was visible. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but sheer adrenaline pushed me to my feet. I swung the fire poker wildly, the metal slicing through empty air as the figure darted back with inhuman speed. It let out a low, guttural growl, its glowing eyes narrowing as though amused by my futile attempt to fight back. The whispers shifted, their tone sharper, angrier. "You don't belong." The words echoed in my skull, each syllable driving a spike of pain through my temples. The figure lunged, and I barely managed to sidestep in time. Its claws grazed my arm, tearing through my jacket and leaving shallow cuts that burned like fire. I swung the poker again, and this time it connected. The figure recoiled with a screech that rattled the walls, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a brief moment I thought I'd hurt it, but then it straightened, its glowing eyes blazing brighter than before. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. The cabin trembled, the walls groaning as though under immense pressure. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I realized with a sinking dread that the entire structure was collapsing. The figure lunged again, and I threw myself toward the doorway, narrowly avoiding its outstretched claws. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the cabin collapsing in a cloud of dust and splintered wood behind me. The forest was alive now, its once silent trees groaning and swaying as though in anger. The air crackled with a strange energy, and the ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though it might open up and swallow me whole. I didn't know where I was running, only that I needed to get as far away as possible. But the forest wasn't letting me go. The shadows moved with me, darting between the trees, always just out of sight. The growls and whispers followed, a relentless chorus that sapped my strength and resolve. Branches clawed at my face and arms, tearing my clothes and drawing blood. The forest didn't want me to leave, and it was making sure I knew it. I stumbled into a clearing, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The space was unnatural, the ground bare and cracked, as though nothing had dared grow there for centuries. In the center stood a massive stone, weathered and covered in moss, its surface etched with the same strange symbols I'd seen in the cabin. The air around it pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of some unseen creature. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming words that sent a chill down my spine. Join us, feed us, become. The shadows began to coalesce at the edges of the clearing, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, like puppets with invisible strings. I backed away, my eyes darting around the clearing for any possible escape, but the shadows closed in, their glowing eyes locking onto me with predatory intent. The stone pulsed brighter, its light casting twisted shadows that danced like flames. The whispers became a deafening roar, and I clapped my hands over my ears, sinking to my knees as the weight of their presence bore down on me. Desperation drove me to action. I reached into my pack and pulled out a flare, the bright red cylinder shaking in my trembling hands. I struck it, the flare sputtering to life with a hiss. The clearing was bathed in a harsh, flickering light, and the shadows recoiled, their forms flickering like smoke in the wind. I didn't hesitate. I hurled the flare at the stone, the bright flame striking its surface and igniting the dry moss. The forest erupted in an unearthly wail, a sound so loud and primal it felt like the earth itself was screaming. The shadows dissolved, their forms dissipating into the air like ash, and the oppressive weight lifted. The moment the shadows vanished, the forest seemed to exhale, the tension in the air dissipating like a receding storm. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost peaceful in comparison. But I knew better than to linger. The forest had let me go, but I didn't know for how long. I stumbled back the way I'd come, my legs weak and unsteady, every step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The claw marks on my arm throbbed, and my jacket was soaked with sweat and blood. The forest seemed to shift around me, the once twisting paths now leading me back toward the trailhead. It felt like the forest was guiding me out, though whether out of pity or some deeper purpose I couldn't say. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the ranger station in the distance, a wave of relief washed over me. I collapsed onto the porch, my body trembling with exhaustion. The world felt distant, unreal, as though I'd left part of myself behind in the forest. I filed a report the next day, leaving out the parts no one would believe. Erica Lang was officially declared missing, though I knew the truth. The forest had taken her, just as it had tried to take me. I resigned from my post a week later, unable to face the woods again. But even now, far from Pine Hollow, I can't escape its grip. Shadows move in the corners of my vision, and I hear faint whispers in the dead of night. The claw marks on my arm haven't healed. The scars a constant reminder of what I saw. The forest doesn't forget.